Page 300, Chapter 6, Modern Period. Tradition and Experiment in Modern Poetry, para. It is difficult to decide exactly as to when the modern age began and the Victorian age ended. In literature, there can be no watertight compartments and no definite line of demarcation separating the past from the present. However, the year 1890 may be taken to be the turning point, for by this date most of the great Victorians were either dead or had practically ceased to write. Much that is traditional and Victorian still persists and will continue to influence modern poetry, but the new revolutionary forces become more and more prominent, and it is clear that the future has with them. Modern century poetry is a curious mixture of the traditional and the experimental, of the old and the new. It is complex and many-sided. Para. When Thomas Hardy died in 1928, the world appeared to be recovering from the consequences of the First World War, though the recovery had been slow and painful, and long-sighted people were still uneasy about the outlook. The League of Nations had failed to bring about the state of international harmony hoped for by its founders, and poverty and social unrest persisted in many places. Then, as the 1930s approached, a worldwide financial crisis struck both rich and poor, threatening ruin to whole nations as well as bringing misery and want to unnumbered families and individual persons. In Britain and elsewhere, millions of unemployed created a grave social problem, and hitherto flourishing industrial regions became, quote, distressed areas, unquote, stop. An account of the state of the country at that time can be found in J.B. Priestley's Priestley', An English Journey, 1934. In Germany, the burden of unemployment created the conditions that Hitler exploited as a stepping stone to autocratic power, which he used to rearm the nation and thus re-employ the multitudes of workless in feverish preparations for military supremacy. The god of war, overthrown in 1918, was mounting his throne again, not only in Germany but also in Japan, whose militarists made war in China, in Italy, where Mussolini dreamt of a modern Roman Empire and prepared for conquest in Abyssinia and Libya, and in Spain, where a civil war raged with terrifying savagery. Para. In these circumstances, many writers became convinced that literature was useless if it did not serve a definite social and political purpose, and those who failed to save this conviction were thought to be skulking, skulking, in the ivory tower of mere literary art. The poetry and prose of the 1930s returned, therefore, to the serious mood which had dominated the mid-Victorian period, but with a difference. The Victorians had been mainly preoccupied with the, quote, condition of England, unquote, question, that is, the problem of how to uplift the poor, and their literature was permeated by a spirit of non-violent humanitarianism. The writings of the 1930s, however, were as much preoccupied with the condition of the whole world, for air travel had made the world appear as small a place as Britain, a country before, and humanitarian hopefulness had been displaced by partisan propaganda, which by implication, if not explicitly, offered some particular political doctrine as a means to world salvation. Para. The case for literature with a purpose is obvious. The case against it is less so. Literature is more than pamphleteering, page 301. Otherwise, many thousands of pamphlets now forgotten would still be read as much as novels and poetry are read. Literature is not the mere statement of a problem, however important, not simply the pleading of a cause, however worthy. Literature is a creative art written by creative literary artists. The motive power of artists is imagination, which endows them with vision and the perception of truth in its full aspect. A vision of truth is the peculiar and special contribution which a great poet or a great novelist is qualified to give to mankind. It is a vision of the beauty and perfection that is humanity's idealism, the end toward which all things move. But they move with agonizing slowness, painful step by painful step, and it is with this almost imperceptible progress that politicians and sociologists are concerned. Politics, it has been said, is the art of the possible. In contrast, it can be said that poetry is the art of the desirable. When a poet attempts to harness his talent to current practical problems, he is more likely to cripple his own imagination than to serve mankind, for a poet very rarely allows importance to significant facts while he commands a vision of ultimate truth. If he loses that vision through a misapplied concern with facts, he sacrifices his birthright and betrays his mission. He becomes, bracket opens, modifying lines used by George Meredith in another connection in Modern Love, bracket closes, a rapid falcon, Falcon, condemned to do the flitting of a bat. Such is the end to which poets have come when they have been unwisely possessed by a conviction that literature is unworthy if it does not develop a social conscience in relation to immediate affairs. Much literature in the 1930s was conscience-ridden in that way, and the writers and works of the period, when sifted by posterity, will in all probability be valued in proportion to the degree in which they looked beyond the disturbances of their own period. From his ivory tower, the poet or novelist may see more and speak more, saving wisdom, than if he descends to bustle about in the political cockpit. Stop para. Abundance of output. One of the leading characteristics of the poetry of the new era is the abundance of its output. The variety and quantity of modern publications is bewildering, and one is baffled by the variety of names and labels which are used. This abundance of output has naturally resulted in the lowering of quality. Much that is published fails to achieve the highest standards. Moreover, modern poetry is a poetry of revolt against tradition, and as such there is much in it that is experimental, ephemeral, and puerile. This is why Roy Campbell describes modern poetry as, quote, an epidemic of intellectual and emotional diarrhea, unquote, and A.C. Ward finds it, quote, eccentric, wayward, puerile, and commonplace, unquote, stop. There is no doubt that standards of poetic composition have gone down, and there is much eccentricity and whimsicality, but there can be no denying the fact that some of the modern poets are of outstanding excellence, and the poems produced by them are of permanent and universal significance. It is an age of great poetry, but not of such dominating poets as Tennyson or Browning. The modern temper is too individualistic for such domination. There can be no masters in the modern era. Each writes according to his own mood and temper, producing poems of merit along with much that is worthless. It is an age of anthologies which bring together the select works of several hands for the delight of the readers. Para. Note of revolt. The new poetry is a poetry of revolt resulting largely from the impact of science. This revolt is to be seen both in the form and content of poetry. Increasingly, the poet turns away from the decadent romantic tradition, a tradition which still persists in Georgian poetry. This revolt is best exemplified in the poetry of T.S. Eliot. The poet sees life in its naked realism, and even the most prosaic and commonplace subjects are considered suitable. Quote, the heavy thud of bus traffic, the creaking of tram cars, the rattling noise of railway trains, the drone of an aeroplane, all these find their echo in modern poetry. Stop, unquote. The squalor and dinginess of an industrial civilization are reflected everywhere in the works of poets like T.S. Eliot. After the war, poems appear in an ever-increasing number on the destructive means of warfare. The imagery and vocabulary of the modern poet reflect the influence of science and scientific inventions. Realism in subject matter has led the modern poet to reject the highly ornate and artificial poetic style of the Romantics in favor of a language which resembles closely the language of everyday life. Modern poetry is characterized by the use of colloquial diction, speech rhythms, and prosaic words. This realism in diction and versification and in subject matter is a marked feature of the poetry of T.S. Eliot. Page 302, para. Delight in the sensuous beauty of nature. But this does not mean that the ugliness and murkiness of the machine age have lessened man's joy in the beauty of nature. For the modern poet, nature is a box of toys which delights his heart and which is very dear to him. A deep feeling of love and joy in nature is a prominent characteristic of such poets as W. H. Davis, Walter de la Mare, and Edmund Blunden, Blunden. But the modern poet does not spiritualize nature like Wordsworth, nor does he intellectualize her like Shelley. Rather, he is content to render her through the senses, and his rendering of her is remarkable for its realism and precision in detail. However, Eliot does not write of nature of the countryside. His poetry is strictly urban. Para. The humanitarian spirit. Nor does the modern poet love nature alone. He also loves and feels for the lower animals living in the lap of nature. He is moved by their suffering and makes a forceful plea for a more humane treatment of the dumb creation. Indeed, humanitarianism, a deepened sense of pity for the poor and the suffering, is a leading characteristic of modern poetry. The spread of democracy has made the poet more and more conscious of the dignity of man, and he perceives, quote, in the daily struggle of the poor the same potentialities of a spiritual conflict that the older poets find in those of exalted rank, unquote. Stop. Gibson in particular is the champion of the underdog and the downtrodden. Even such outcasts of society as criminals, suicides, prostitutes, drunkards, etc., find a sympathetic treatment. Attention is focused on their problems and society is held responsible for their degeneracy. Davidson and Masefield are other poets who take pains to glorify and reveal the heroism of the mean, obscure, and squalid existence of the have-nots. Even the flesh, the body, and the physical is glorified. Thus, D.H. Lawrence considers, quote, the flesh as being wiser than the intellect, unquote, stop, para. Disillusionment. The new poetry is realistic and the poet's consciousness of the grim realities of life has shattered all illusions and romantic dreams. The tragedy of everyday life has induced in the poet a mood of disillusionment, and so the poetry today is bitter and pessimistic. The pessimism of the modern poet is more poignant and heart-rending, even more than the pessimism of Hardy, because it arises out of the contemplation of the stark realities of life, and there is nothing sentimental about it. Thus, Housman, Housman, considers that the wages of man is, quote, dust, unquote, stop. Eliot regards man as, quote, hollow, unquote, and, quote, stuffed, stuffed, unquote, comma, and in the Crazy Gen, CRAZY-JANE poems of W.B. Yeats, comma, quote, human sorrow becomes an elemental passion, profound, eternal, and burning like a flame, unquote, stop. The Great War was a nerve-shattering experience. Man lost faith in accepted values, and as a consequence, this note of bitterness is even more pronounced after the war. The wasteland reflects the tragic gloom and despair of the post-war world. However, this does not mean that 20th century poetry is a poetry of despair. As a matter of fact, the modern poet sees life as a whole, wants to face it squarely, and has no wish to escape from it into a world of dreams. He looks at life without the spectacle of romance and paints it as he finds it in all its ugliness and in all its misery and headburn. Nor has he lost his capacity for laughter. Even in the works of the most pessimistic of poets, we find wit, satire, humor, grim jest, and jokes. Sometimes even serious subjects are treated in the poetry of Eliot and others in a tone of levity and flippancy. Para, the religious note. As a result of science and the spirit of rationalism, the poet is skeptical about God. Hardy laughs ironically at him, H capital, and Housman does not hesitate to call him, H capital, quote, a brute or a blackguard, unquote, stop. But this does not mean that religion is no longer a source of inspiration in the new poetry. In T.S. Eliot and Francis Thompson, we find a revival of Christian mysticism. Masefield's The Everlasting Mercy has a religious theme, and there are many fine devotional lyrics scattered all over his work. Even today, there are mystical poets in the tradition of Blake and Wordsworth. Thus, D.H. Lawrence has his mystic, quote, religion of blood, unquote, comma, and speaks of strange dark gods. W.B. Yeats is a mystic visionary in whose poetry the gods and fairies of Celtic mythology live again, and T.S. Eliot finds the steel point in the supernal. Stop, para. The metaphysical note. Besides the influence of science, religion, and mysticism, many other influences are at work on the modern poet. There has been a revival of interest in the poetry of Donne, D-O-N-N-E, and the other metaphysical poets of the 17th century. Grierson's edition of Donne's poems was published in 1912, and ever since English poetry has reflected more and more the intellectual qualities of Donne's poetry. Eliot has done much to bring about this metaphysical revival. Thus, we find in his poetry the same use of startling, far-fetched imagery, the same bringing together of opposites, page 303, the same desire to startle and surprise, and thus to capture attention. Para. Symbolism. Despite its stark realism in theme and treatment, there also runs a vein of romanticism in modern poetry, which has filtered through the pre-Raphaelites and the decadence of the 1890s. Much of Georgian and Edwardian poetry is in the romantic strain. We find this strain of romance in the poetry of Walter de la Mare, John Masefield, and Edward Thomas. De la Mare has remarkable sense of the supernatural, and Elroy, E-L-R-O-Y, Flecker, F-L-E-C-K-E-R, excel in creating an oriental atmosphere. Masefield and Yeats, with all their earthiness, have the romantic longing for a more perfect world. They would like to escape into a fairyland on love. A dominant theme of the Romantics has not altogether died out. Robert Bridges has left behind him some fine love lyrics, and W.B. Yeats has been called the greatest love poet of the 20th century. In France, this note of romance is struck by the French symbolist Laforgue, Laforgue, Vertain, Vertainan, Mallarme, Mallarme. Under the influence of French symbolists, poets like Yeats and Eliot make extensive use of symbolism to communicate their vision and sensations, often too complex and intricate to be conveyed in any other way. Such use of symbolism often results in ambiguity and obscurity. Para. Poetry and the other art forms. Modern poetry has also been influenced by the techniques of music, sculpture, painting, and other fine arts. The modern poet freely uses the vocabulary and techniques of the other arts. Thus, we find C.E. Cumming, C-U-M-M-I-N-G, reducing his poems to mere typographical designs, and the Sitwells, Sitwells, try to imitate the Cubist, Cubist, painter. However, it is music which has exercised the profoundest influence. Stop. The Sitwells, for example, care more for the sound than the meaning of their words. The variations and repetitions in T.S. Eliot's The West Land are like the movements of a symphony, so much so that I.A. Richards calls his poetry, quote, the music of ideas, unquote, stop. Like a musician's phrases, Eliot's ideas are arranged, not that they may tell us something, but that their effects in us may combine into a coherent whole of feeling and attitude. The technique of the cinematograph is also exploited by the poet of the West Land. Unrelated scenes are presented to create a dramatic situation, like shots of unrelated scenes in a movie. The movement is speeded up and there are no connections or linking up of passages. Thus, the poet today commands a richer and more varied medium of expression than ever before. Para. New techniques. The modern poet is constantly experimenting with new verse forms and poetic techniques. The use of slang and colloquialism has become common. The language and rhythm of poetry approximate more and more to those of common speech. the bonds of meter have been loosened, and the use of verse, V-E-R-S-E, libre, L-I-B-R-E, has become increasingly common. No rules of rhyme or meter are followed. Stresses vary according to emotion, and verse rhythm is replaced by sense rhythm. Symbols, often purely personal, are used in abundance to express pure sensations and visions, and the result is increased vagueness and obscurity of such poets as Yeats and T.S. Eliot. Under the influence of modern psychologists Freud, Jung, and Bergs, Freud, F-R-E-U-D, Jung, J-U-N-G, and Bergs, B-E-R-G-S, the probing into and the depiction of the subconscious and the unconscious has become commonplace. Emphasis has shifted from the externals to the rendering of the psyche, P-S-Y-C-H-E, stop, para. Some innovations, Impressionism, Imagism, and Surrealism are some other innovations in modern poetry. The Impressionists seek to convey the vague, fleeting sensations passing through their minds by the use of a novel imagery and metaphor. The images, headed by Ezra Pound, aim at clarity of expression through the use of hard, accurate, and definite images to convey their intellectual and emotional complexes. The surrealists try to express whatever passes in the subconscious or even the unconscious, without any control or selection by the conscious. These innovations have influenced the art of Eliot in various ways. All this increases the complexity of modern poetry and the bafflement of the reader. Such innovations may be dismissed as mere freaks, not likely to strike any deep roots. However, the poet today does not care for this. He is extremely sincere and writes according to his own conviction without caring whether he is appreciated or not.